So the date is January 15th, 2009. U.S. Airways Flight 1549, captained by Chesley Sully Sullenberger, took off from New York LaGuardia's airport. Sully was a really very highly experienced and accomplished pilot. He had something like 20,000 flight miles under his belt at that point. But on this day, shortly after takeoff, a flock of Canada geese flies in front of the plane, striking and disabling both engines completely. So here we are, just a few seconds, a few miles from takeoff at LaGuardia over the Hudson River, and the plane has zero thrust. They're at about 3,000 feet, beginning to descend quickly. Sully radios a mayday call back to air traffic control, letting them know that they'd struck birds, they'd lost both engines, and that he wanted to attempt to return back to LaGuardia to land safely. A few seconds later, though, he quickly makes the assessment that they'd be unable to make it all the way back on a glide alone, that they were too far away. He didn't want to risk crash landing in a crowded city. So he directs the plane to the most open, although unconventional option he had available at the time, which was an emergency landing right there in the Hudson. And the rest, as I'm sure most are on the call today are aware of, is history. Sully was able to land the plane safely on the Hudson, all 155 people on board surviving the ordeal, all thanks to his ability to call on decades of experience and adapt to a situation that dictated a new approach. So what does this have to do with the territory plan, you might be asking, our conversation today? Well, look, despite all of Sully's preparation and planning and precaution, the flight encountered an unexpected event, and it completely upended the plan, right? And Sully was able to make quick decisions to really save many lives in the face of uncertainty. And I understand this is perhaps a bit more dramatic than the world of B2B buying and selling, but I'd argue that the message is the same. As a sales professional, you're going to encounter unexpected situations throughout the course of a year. Nevertheless, you've got a target to hit, right? So despite all of your planning and strategizing and prioritizing at the start of a given year, circumstances change, especially in the environment that we've been living and working in for the past year and a half. And the ability to draw on that experience that you've built over time and adapt to events as they unfold, as circumstances dictate, can mean all the difference towards your final outcome. Now, before we get into the lesson, Sully was quoted afterwards when he was asked how he was able to pull it off. And I think this really sums up the idea for me. He said, one way of looking at this might be that for 42 years, I've been making small, regular deposits in this bank of experience and education and training. And on January 15th, the balance was sufficient so that I could go back and make a very large withdrawal. And that's something I want you to keep in mind as we go throughout this. Are you building experiences? Are you making small deposits in the bank of experience so that when an unexpected event occurs with a customer or with an opportunity that you're managing, you can go and make a withdrawal and decide, hey, we're going to innovate here. We're going to try a new approach and we're going to get to a good outcome. So let's get into it. And back to this idea that we're living in uncertain times and that we're selling in uncertain times. If you've been following along with Challenger for the past year plus, we've been doing a lot of continuous research to keep our finger on the pulse of how organizations have been navigating this environment. Every month, we survey senior executives and commercial leaders and sales professionals on a variety of topics. One of which, as you can see on the top of the page, is these individuals' perception of and optimism around three things. One, their professional future. Two, their organization's future. And then three, the business environment in general. And as you can see, since 2020, this trend line's a bit of a roller coaster ride, right? Now, nevertheless, in each of the three, the arrow is pointing up at the moment. But this also means a new set of challenges and uncertainty ahead, because as things begin to open up again, as you can see on the bottom, markets are becoming crowded, or at the very least noisy. So we're observing quite a bit of noise in this landscape as suppliers and solutions providers get back out there and they try to create and capture pent-up demand where hopefully there is some. Not to mention all the supply side issues that many industries are dealing with, or the threat of inflation. What's happening here is there's new sort of circumstances and nuances created in different categories and verticals every day, and so we got to keep on our toes, because while things are improving and have improved, they're still uncertain. Point is, as we sit here, July 8th, whether you're halfway through your calendar fiscal year or just starting a new one with the July 1st fiscal or anywhere in between, as a professional seller with a target, it's a good time to reassess your plan, because it's likely that circumstances within just your territory or your limited set of opportunities have actually changed quite a bit in the past few months. Some of the accounts we were pursuing in January or thought were high priority may no longer be as attractive as they were. Others may have emerged and are quite sort of viable now, where perhaps they were on your do not touch list just 6 months ago. But for the sake of today's conversation, I want to start there. I want to go back to January real quick. And Jen, this is where I'd love for you to chime in. I'm sure your experiences navigating this first half of 2021, coming out of a very uncertain and difficult 2020, have been interesting, have been challenging, and I think probably similar to a lot of the folks on the call today. But as you think back to where you were in January, you've just been given a new territory and a quota. What's your plan Jan 1? Walk us through your thought process. What are you doing from a planning perspective?
Yeah, sure. So if I think back to this year's Jan 1, our organization had just gone through a pretty significant change in the sense that we split out hunting and farming. And so I'm on the hunter side. And like many of us, I think, I had a territory where I had a couple of states I've been working for years, and then a few states that were new to the territory. So I did have a little bit of historical context on some of the territory. But for me, I think there's a lot of smart approaches to territory prioritization. I prefer to kind of keep things simple. So I operate off of a kind of 4-piece segmentation where I'm dividing it into accounts that fall into A classification, which are, there's something I know about that account that gives me a ton of confidence that they would make a good fit. So for what I sell, right, it might be we have a former client that has just stepped into the head of sales role. It might be we work with a lot of others in their industry. It might be there's been such a fundamental shift in their market that I know it's affecting the sales organization. Those are places where I feel super confident about my ability to reframe and have a strong message for why engage with our organization. So that's my A. My B is like accounts that are almost there, but there's something missing. So to be specific, it might be we work with a lot of folks in their space, but I look at the head of sales and they've been there for 20 years. So my thought process might be, how open is this person going to be towards change? So there's something missing that puts them into the B. The C is kind of the widest net. This is nothing to indicate that they'd be good fits, nothing to indicate they'd be bad fits. I just don't know enough at this point in January. So that's gonna be my largest segment. And then my Ds are something where, maybe we've worked with in the past, it was a bad experience, or there's something happening in their market that just wouldn't necessitate a need for increasing demand. That's going to be probably equivalent to the size of my A segment in terms of size. But for me, I keep it simple, right? I've got these 4 buckets. Then what I'm looking to do is, in partnership with my SDR, sit down first and foremost and focus on the A's. And what I'm trying to do at this stage is simply to say, what is that reason for why? Like, what got me fired up? How do I get my SDR fired up for the purpose of why they should take a meeting? And really spending a lot of time up front thinking about that narrative and what's that reason, why them, why now? From there, once we've gone through those A accounts and have a plan and sort of a talk track, then it's working through B to sort of figure out where are the best B opportunities and how do we want to phase those in? So I think in terms of execution, A's are getting hit every single week. B's might be every other week, but we've got to kind of bake them in to the outreach. And then when we hit maybe March, then we're starting to look at the C accounts and just revisit the D's to make sure that there hasn't been something that's changed that might pull them back up in the prioritization. So it's really about figuring out, like, why do I get excited about reaching out to these folks? How do I get my SDR aligned and thinking the same way as me for what's the reason, why them, why now? And then obviously just setting some basic call number targets to make sure that we're hitting the right volumes to be able to cast the net wide enough to hit all of those top priority accounts.
I love the system. Let me ask you now as we fast forward. So that's January. You kind of walked us through, what you're doing throughout the months between January and July. Like, we're in July now, so we're still in this uncertain landscape. Things are evolving continuously. But as we move from planning our approach and identifying our priority opportunities to evaluating performance in them, to modifying a plan perhaps if needed, to starting to look towards the finish line and reverse engineering our gap to go a little bit more precisely. are you sticking with the plan? What's changed? Like, how are you evaluating some of these things where you need to reassess and modify if appropriate? What's the latest?
Yeah. No, I think in July we all remember that assumptions are just that, assumptions, right? And you learn and you see, especially this year, I think it's been fascinating. Some of the assumptions I made around demand in January are completely different now. So you go back, you revisit those assumptions and you say, what's changed? So I'll give you a great example. There was a company that in my mind kind of fell into A status in the sense that we had worked with them in the past. They had been hit rather dramatically last year. So they sell fleets of cars. They took a huge hit because companies were traveling and no one was buying fleets of cars. And so in January, that circumstance was still the same. Fast forward to July, now there's not enough cars to fulfill the demand, right? And so for us, I think one of the things that we've tried that I'm pretty excited about that's new this year for our team is we've said these assumptions we made in January, so much has changed in the market. Rather than just rely on annual reports and investor presentations, which do a good job of just giving us good indicators, I think the really cool thing that we've started doing is saying, look, at the end of the day, like it's the person who uses the product whose input matters the most. And we've always called on heads of sales or heads of marketing or heads of sales training. Now for our team, what we're doing is we're actually calling on some sellers. And some of you on the line actually may have gotten some of these calls just to understand, like, what is the environment in which you're operating now? Like, what's demand look like? And how does it feel? And what do you wish you had more of? And so what I get excited about is this is almost a validation to the current state assumptions we're making. And I think we've been surprised and learned some really fascinating things that's caused me to go back and say, shoot, some of these assumptions I made about A priority accounts are completely off. And so I got to pull those down into C's or D's, and maybe I learned something that lifts another industry up. But I think understanding and looking at it from the perspective of what is the current state of that organization, what's changed in their market, even between January and July, is just absolutely necessary right now.
Well, and I think it's important because I think while the die may be mostly cast for some folks on the line and it's just mostly about execution, I think many people will really need to hustle and try to figure out, what portions of the plan need to change. And I love your idea, which we'll unpack in a minute, around calling other people to get more information from inside the organization to really validate whether or not your plan still holds up or you need to reassess and do something different. And I think it's important because according to our latest poll, I'll just quickly show this here, it does look like the majority of us will need to find at least a couple more opportunities that haven't yet presented themselves in order to build enough pipeline to get to where we need to be from a quota perspective. You can take a look at this here. We went out to a few different audiences of sellers and sales leaders last week and essentially asked, what else do you need to hit quota this year at the halfway point, right? How much more pipeline do you need to build? What percentage do you need to grow your pipeline to get there? And the majority are telling us it's at least a few more, if not going to be a heavy lift, growing at anywhere between 11 and 50% in terms of total pipeline to get to quota. So there's still work to do. And I think the point we make at the beginning of every planning cycle is you're going to need to find some of those unconventional opportunities in order to get to that number. It's not all going to be black and white. And for the rest of our time today, we're going to share a couple of very practical recommendations for how you might go about reassessing your territory plan to uncover a few of those new opportunities that you're going to need to get you to where you need to be. The first thing to do, and we just talked about this a little bit, validating or changing our assumptions about those known or existing opportunities in the territory here. And the first step, as Jen had mentioned, is, again, do your research, check out recent changes, current events, reports, and announcements. You should be subscribed to relevant reports and announcements coming from the opportunities in your pool anyway. Jen, where do you look? What are you looking for? What's sort of your continuous, opportunity research motion, if you will?
Yeah, so I think especially for my A accounts, I've got investor presentation dates flagged, right? So I want to be alerted, not just forgetting and then remembering after long efforts happened, right? So I love reading investor presentations because there's always some sort of narrative from the leadership team about what they're trying to achieve and what's hard about kind of getting there. So that's a really big one for me. And then I use LinkedIn Sales Navigator pretty heavily as well, simply because, again, I like the push aspect of if there's increase in hiring, if there's, leadership changes, I want to be alerted to those things versus doing a complete heavy lift, every month or every 6 months to try to figure those things out. So I rely on those two pretty heavily.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, the good hygiene effectively is kind of what we're talking about here, right?
Mhm.
The second piece is where it gets interesting though, and this is, Jen mentioned this a moment ago, it's talk to accessible stakeholders. And by accessible, we mean someone other than your intended target, right? The CXO, him or herself, but rather someone who's both accessible and credible can give you valuable information, as Jen mentioned. Instead of trying to call and talk to, a global CSO in an organization, for instance, can we talk to managers across the organization who have a good sense for what that senior leader, that exec level leader is going to care about, or recent changes in the organization that could either validate or require you to reassess or disqualify an opportunity altogether. If the number is, I think, 17 or 18 touch points to try to schedule a first sales meeting as of right now, is it maybe 2 touch points that can get you to a manager who's in the know to help you either sharpen that message or disqualify the opportunity and save you a bunch of time if it's no longer valid? Jen, what's the angle for you here? Like what kind of value, I guess, first and foremost, like if we're going to call someone, what kind of value can we deliver to them so that it's not a waste of their time, but seen as a value add conversation in 2 directions?
Yeah, great question. So I think I would love to take credit for this idea. This is not my idea. I'm just really passionate about it. I think for us, right, when we think about our thing that we're selling, right, we're selling sales methodology, we're selling transformation. It is so critical for us to understand what's the current state of that organization. So when our SDRs are calling in to a company, they can't just call on a CSO and say, hey, do you want to better your sales organization? And if we think about anyone that manages or is an SDR on the line, like it's kind of crazy how much we put on the shoulders of these folks to actually do.
Yeah.
We put the heaviest lift on them, right? And they've got the least amount of experience of anyone on the team. So I think where this idea kind of originated was, how do we make it easier for the SDRs to provide lift in a way that's meaningful, that isn't just making 50 dials a day and getting nowhere? And so the structure that we've taken for this approach is to say, we do the same thing I talked about before. I still have to arm the SDR with the why am I asking you to call in this particular account? But then what we're looking to source from that conversation is, what is that seller's perspective on their current state, right? So for us, are they getting any training? What's particularly hard about selling in this market versus last year's market? What are some of the things that they are just struggling to sort of figure out that they wish the organization would do a better job of arming them to overcome?
I think the really interesting observation that perhaps many people are making right now, as you describe this, is, well, that's discovery, right? Like, we're doing discovery. And I think that's 100% true. This is discovery to kind of figure out where we can make an impact in an organization, but it's centered on delivering value. It's centered on, exchange for information that's going to allow us to figure out if there's an opportunity here. You individually, you personally can benefit from some of the things that I can share, either advice, tactics, frameworks, or free training in some way, shape, or form as well. So
Exactly.
I love the approach and just getting people talking to people to kind of better understand the situation. So you do all that, right? And you're armed with this information. It gives you a better sense of whether or not your assumptions about the opportunity early in the planning cycle are still valid, or if they've changed. You can prioritize your time and effort accordingly. At the very least, it allows you to sharpen your message to that senior leader if you're going back to them. And so hopefully you can do a better job of tailoring, which we know is a foundational challenger principle, so that it's not 17 or 18 touch points, but maybe in the single digits. That would be great, right? Which brings us to the second concept or tactic that we'd like to just emphasize before we wrap up today. And that is sort of, if we think about the common approach to planning, and Jen, you kind of touched on some of these as you walk through sort of your prioritization and tiering model, but it all has to do with how we initially make our assumptions and establish our territory at the outset. Handful of the most common, factors that sales professionals use to develop that plan, and you touched on these, right? Revenue band, a scoring system or a tiering system that may come centrally, or you've created your own. Industry vertical category, or if you're managing or picking up a pool of existing accounts, you're looking at things like annual spend, attach rate, utilization rate, all good stuff. None of it's bad, need all of them.
Mm-hmm.
We'd argue these are table stakes though. In our estimation, we'd say that, in an uncertain environment or a complex environment, the list is missing something that's truly going to allow us to be really agile in our planning and our execution and be able to pivot should unexpected circumstances arise and we actually need to look under different rocks to find the opportunities that we didn't know existed before. So going beyond surface level planning, we take this sort of approach that we would say that, hey, a challenger sales professional is always looking for this thing we call reframe potential. So in addition to the table stakes building blocks of strategic planning, reframe potential is essentially the measure of how likely you are as a company, as an individual, as a solutions provider, to be able to educate your customer by leading with that new insight, right? Ultimately leading with something, teaching them something that's going to change the way they look at their business and point them in a new direction towards your solution, right? Towards the solution to a problem that they didn't even realize existed or they were overlooking. And at the end of the day, on the right-hand side here, reframe potential requires three things of us in our company. We've got to be able to do these three for us to consider something high reframe potential. Number one, first, we need to confirm that indeed we can meaningfully impact their financial situation. So that's sort of a non-starter. Do we have a solution that could legitimately increase revenue or reduce costs, right? That's a very clean way to determine. Second, we must confirm that we do have an insight that's actually going to reveal or expose something that they've overlooked or underappreciated. So not something obvious, something they'll sit up and pay attention to and say, never looked at it that way or didn't realize it was costing us this much. I'm willing to take that conversation. Which third, we lead to this idea of needing a tangible cost associated with that problem. As we all know by now, in order to move a customer off their status quo, we need to be able to help them quantify the fact that their pain of same, if you will, the current state is greater than the cost of the solution we're proposing they consider, or the pain of change. If we can confirm these three requirements, we likely have a pretty strong reframe potential within an account or an opportunity. Then it becomes about execution once we narrow down our priority list. Jen, I know you use reframe potential, but how do you think about it in practical application every day?
Yeah, you guys introduced this last year on one of the webinars last year, and I just loved the way that you've defined this, because I think if you're on this call, right, I'm going to make the assumption that you do not want to be one of those sellers that take a spray and pray approach, right? So you look at the factors on the left and say, okay, here's our message, just you opt in or opt out. To me, what I think about this right side is, this is the reason why the customer should get excited. This is the reason why I should get excited. What is it that actually is going to compel them to make a change? All we talk about in Challenger all the time is this idea of pain of same versus pain of change. If I do not feel confident in this message on the right-hand side, I will knock that account down farther in the list. I won't just go after it because they have a large sales force or because they have large revenue bands. And Mike and I were talking about this the other day. Like when I first started selling, I'd look at like a Google or an Amazon and say, man, that should be priority A because they're so big. But you've got to think about like the reality of what you're walking into. For us, it's like a lot of the largest organizations out there have their own sales training methodology, and to break it is a big uphill battle. It doesn't mean that I don't go after them, but I probably don't put them in opportunity A, because I'm going to look at a company who's saying, gosh, we don't have anything systematic, and there has been change in our market, and we used to be order takers, and now orders aren't coming in. Like those to me are things that I get excited about because the reframe potential is so very high. So I think, Mike, your point is really well put. Don't get lost in the things on the left. They're necessary, but they're not enough to create a really compelling message that's going to cut through that kind of outbound noise you talked about in the first slide.
Yeah, the largest potential opportunity is going to come from the less obvious ones, I think. And that's going to be perhaps a surprise to you at first, but certainly a surprise to your customer when you're reaching out, revealing that there's something they've overlooked. Things have evolved in their industry and their world faster than they realized. And there's an opportunity either to mitigate risk or improve performance. So very quickly, tactically, before we wrap up here, we created a useful tool. As an enablement professional myself, I like easy to use, simple frameworks to help people execute in the day-to-day. This is our opportunity scorecard. Nothing complex about this, but it's really designed to just help you force rank your potential pursuits based on their reframe potential. And so you get a little bit more tactical here. You start using these 4 questions. What's the status quo or current behavior I want to correct? What incorrect assumptions lead to this behavior? What doesn't the customer know about this problem but should? And then, is the pain of same greater than pain of change? You take those 4 questions, you map them to this scorecard framework that we're sort of introducing here. We've shared this before. It's a tool that we've prescribed in the past. But if it's new for you, very simple to use, 1 to 5 Likert scale. Figure out your answers to those questions after you've done some research and validated, and then determine whether or not you've got high reframe potential to start preparing your outreach, hopefully in a very tailored fashion. And at the very least, if you need to talk to some people who are hopefully accessible or credible, as we talked about before, to round out that perspective and validate, this gives you your, top 10 list, if you will.
Yeah, and the only thing I was going to add here is if you are a manager of a sales team, I've always found it bizarre that managers kind of just leave territory prioritization kind of up to the seller, right? It's probably one of the most important things we do. This is an awesome set of coaching questions to ask next week, this week, whenever you've got your next one-on-one.
That's a great call out, Jen. Yeah. All right. So key takeaways for today. We like to use our stop, start, continue framework to kind of wrap these things up. We'll go through key takeaways, then I'll share a couple of resources available to activation portal users, and we'll take some questions. So first and foremost, stop using only surface level inputs like revenue band, industry vertical, traditional account potential inputs. We're limiting our ability to find the diamonds in the rough by keeping them surface level at the table stakes. And to that end, start using reframe potential if you haven't already to really uncover those overlooked opportunities. Again, you're placing emphasis on how this ever-changing environment is potentially bringing new issues to light for your customers on a continuous basis, and hopefully ones that they've yet to uncover so that you can help them learn more about the issue and lead them on a buying journey that's directed at your solution. And then finally, to bring it back to Sully's famous quote, continue making deposits in your experience account in case you ever need to make a big withdrawal. So in other words, when we encounter those uncertain situations, can we reflexively adapt and pivot as needed and find our way to a better solution, just as Sully did in a split-second decision-making process with an emergency landing in the Hudson. So, all right, for our activation users, very quickly, as we like to do, point you to some resources relevant to today's conversation. Again, you can access the portal here, portal.challengerinc.com. The first thing I'll point to is hopefully by now, if you've been joining us for these webinars, you know of our tempo playbooks across all the stages of the sales process, where we've got useful tools, templates, tactics, video, sort of asynchronous learning opportunities for you to better execute in critical moments. That first stage there, target, there's a whole playbook on focusing your efforts, zeroing in on your research and preparation, preparing to make contact and outreach. Within this playbook here, I want to call attention to one specific resource, which is our opportunity planning and prioritization tool. This is an editable PDF. It's essentially that scorecard we just shared with you, but hopefully in an easy to download, digest, and use manner. So you ask yourself the key questions to figure out if you're spending your time on the right opportunities. Do reach out to let us know if you have any questions on using any of these tools. We hope you can put some of these insights into practice. And the final plug here is join us next month. Our goal this year in 2021 is to just help everyone take away some tactical advice to execute and win those key moments across the sales process every single day. That's this year's theme. Next month's topic, the value demo. So Thursday, August 5th, we've got a conversation that's all about, you guessed it, the ability to articulate value in a very tangible and compelling way in front of customers and prospects. So Jen and I are super excited about this one, especially because we've got a special guest contributor, Russell Worth, who's the VP of Sales Enablement at Showpad. He's going to be joining us, sharing his expertise and experience on the topic. Don't miss it. And of course, for all of our monthly sessions, you can register, sign up, make sure you're following us on LinkedIn to get more information on the topics, participate in the polls that we use to inform these topics. Check out the podcast as well, where we continue the conversation every month and share more tips and tactics and answer more questions that we don't get to on the webinar. So thank you all for joining us and participating today. Let's see if we've got some questions in the chat and we'll work through those.